Okay, so we're um, very fortunate today to have our speakers, and so I'd like to introduce them to you now. First of all, is someone I think many of us are very much familiar with, who's participated in other activities at our congregation. Professor Bill Ong Hing, who is director of the Immigration and Deportation Defense Clinic at the University of San Francisco, and is the founder of the Immigration Legal Resource Center, where he continues to volunteer as general counsel. He's authored numerous academic and practice-oriented publications on immigration and race relations, and there's a whole list of them here, far too many for us to talk about right now. He was also co-counsel and president. He was also counsel in the precedent-setting U.S. Supreme Court asylum case, the INS versus Condoza Fonseca. And so we're very happy to have Professor Hing here. Our other speaker will be Denise Bell, who is the research for refugee and migrant rights at Amnesty International and was previously senior campaigner for refugee and migrant rights, leading implementation of Amnesty's welcoming campaign on refugee rights. She also previously worked for the Department of Justice, where she was attorney advisor of New York Immigration Court. She is now barred in the state of New York and sits on the City Bar's Immigration and National Law Committee. And Denise has recently had surgery, and in spite of that, she's willing to come here and talk with us. So we really do appreciate that. But she has elected to remain off camera. So we, again, appreciate her willingness to come in spite of her surgery. So I think we will just start out with Denise, and she will talk to us and entertain questions when she'll let us know when she's ready for that. And then we'll talk with Bill. Okay, Denise?
Thank you, Jim. And hello, everyone. I just really want to extend my thanks to Jim and UUSF and Gavrila and Amnesty Group 30 for inviting me today. And I apologize for not being on screen. I had some surgery that was rescheduled at the last minute, and I think it's best for all of us if I remain off screen at this moment. There was some facial surgery involved. But I'm really honored to be here today. As Jim said, my name is Denise Bell. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a researcher with Amnesty International, and I'm based in New York City. I work with Amnesty's team to drive work to free people from immigration detention. I'm really honored to be here with Bill, who's legendary, to discuss immigration and human rights in honor of International Human Rights Day. I want to start by acknowledging that the past few months have been incredibly challenging, not just for human rights activists, but for all of us and our loved ones on a personal level. So I'm just so grateful for all of your advocacy and your ongoing work in support of human rights during these times. I'll be focusing today on Amnesty's work specifically on ICE, also known as Immigration and Customs Enforcement, on ICE detention and Amnesty's work around that, including our case actions and our Right for Rights case on family detention. So as the world continues to grapple with COVID-19, tens of thousands of immigrants and asylum seekers detained by ICE have been left behind to face these turbulent times alone in detention facilities, well documented to have substandard medical care, inadequate basic hygiene, and overcrowding. These immigration detention facilities have become tinderboxes for COVID-19, and thousands of people have already contracted the virus while detained, which has left their lives in serious danger, as well as the health and safety of all others in detention. And in further complete disregard for public health measures, thousands more have been deported after exposure to COVID or contracting it due to ICE's inadequate protective measures in detention. So we're seeing how the US government has endangered the lives of people not only here, but also communities in these people's countries of origin. Amnesty's researchers, including myself, have documented how ICE has failed to adequately provide to people in detention basic needs like soap and sanitizer, protective and cleaning supplies, or taken basic COVID-19 precautions like facilitating physical distancing. And we've documented how ICE has failed to halt the unnecessary transfers of people between ICE facilities and from prisons and jails to ICE detention facilities. Dangerous conditions like these have placed people at heightened risk of contracting and becoming severely ill or dying from COVID-19. We've tragically seen several detained individuals die from complications from COVID-19. I'd also like to reiterate it's about people who are in detention, but also facility staff in the surrounding community who are at heightened risk of contracting COVID from ICE's negligent actions. Just 1 month ago, I interviewed a Romanian asylum seeker. He told me he was scared about COVID, not because of other people who were detained with him, but because of all the ICE officials and facility staff coming in every day. He said he felt exposed, unsafe, unlike a sitting duck. He didn't know what precautions the community around him was taking, and there was no place for him to go. ICE wouldn't release him, and he did not want to be deported back to danger. ICE has demonstrated it's not ensuring the safety and health of the people in its custody during this pandemic. So one of our priority objectives at Amnesty has been campaigning since this past spring to free people, including all families together, from detention. Right now, the current ICE population as of December 4th is just over 16,000 people. To give some context, the average daily population last year in 2019 was just over 50,000 people. So that's a huge drop. But the decrease in this number is unfortunately not due really to releases, but really to mass deportations over the past year and the closing of the southern border through a public health pretext, which is factually inaccurate. And some of you might have heard this is the Centers for Disease Control Order, also known as Title 42. There is a lack of transparency from ICE on the number of people they have released and deported, but we are at least seeing detention levels at the lowest level it's been in years. So that is one thing that we are grateful for, but not for the reasons why. And we don't want those numbers to go back up, but I'll get to that in a little bit about what we're going to do around that. In terms of families, there are several dozen detained families right now. They are at 3 family detention centers, one in Pennsylvania called Berks and 2 in Texas. One facility is called Dilley and the other one's called Carnes. After confirmed cases of COVID in these family detention centers, a federal judge described the facilities as on fire with inadequate protective measures. Yet these families continue to be detained and ICE refuses to release them together. In addition to the trauma of prolonged detention, we've seen these families threatened with deportation and separation this year. That's right, separation while in detention. So while we're fighting to keep families together and for their freedom in the US, we're also fighting for them to pursue their right to seek asylum. Right now, there are 28 children and their parents who have been detained for months, the majority of them for over a year and a half, some of them as young as only a few years old, 2 and 3 years old, who could be deported any day now. They've never had the chance to ask for asylum while they've been here. So what we're seeing is how in its final weeks, the Trump administration is doubling down on cruelty by attempting to deny safety to as many families as possible, including by deporting them. Under international law, the US government has an obligation to ensure that the human rights of migrants and asylum seekers are respected, protected, and fulfilled. The US is under the obligation not to return individuals to a situation in which they could be at risk of torture or other serious human rights abuses, as well as the obligation to provide a fair chance at asking for asylum. ICE has the power and obligation to stop this injustice and to not send families back to the very dangers they fled from. Furthermore, just a few months ago in May, I was intimately involved with this, ICE had begun approaching dozens of families with a false so-called choice. They could separate and release their children to sponsors while the parents themselves remained behind in detention, or they could stay together with their kids in family detention indefinitely. An awful, no-win situation that no parent should ever have to face. ICE has the power to release all these families together, and it has historically done so. So we're calling on ICE to do the right thing and to stop playing with people's lives. Release them, don't deport them, and allow them to ask for asylum in safety. But I'd like to say there is some success here, and that's due to people like you. And I'd like to share some of those success stories. Public pressure, plus research, plus congressional advocacy have combined to mount sustained pressure on ICE. ICE has heard from the public through a barrage of emails, calls, and letters, and by raising your voices on social media and in your local press. Your work and the public's work has not only helped prevent the formalization of that horrific so-called binary choice protocol, as I've heard directly from ICE, it also has had a direct impact on the lives of 10 people in our case campaigns. Our collective efforts contributed to the successful release of 4 mothers and their children. Paola and her 1-year-old son, Jose, from Guatemala, and Carla and her 15-year-old daughter, Catherine, Marilyn and her 12-year-old son, Junior, and Juana and her 4-year-old daughter, Norma, all from Honduras. In addition, public action helped free Kelly, who had fled from transgender-based violence in Honduras and was detained by ICE in New Mexico and Colorado for over 1,000 days, which is nearly 3 years. Her lawyers have told us our public activation helped tip the needle and get her out. These efforts, your efforts, were also critical in preventing the deportation of Pastor Stephen Tendo, an ordained minister and human rights activist from Uganda, who has been detained by ICE in the Port Isabel detention facility in Texas for almost 2 years, where his health had been drastically deteriorating. He'd lost vision in one eye, was losing vision in the other. His diabetes, which had been under control when he had been detained, was out of control. After your rapid response actions around the Labor Day weekend, ICE agreed to halt Pastor Stephen's deportation until the Fifth Circuit at federal court hears his appeal on his asylum claim, which is an incredibly rare move. This came from the top of ICE. ICE has begun to give him improved health care, and his situation, his medical health, has stabilized. So I want to thank anybody here who took action and the world in general for helping this person's health improve and to stay the deportation. So to keep up the momentum of our activism, what can the public do now? This year, one of Amnesty's actions featured for our annual Right for Right season is focused on getting all families out of detention together once and for all. Gabriela will be putting these actions in the chat box, and we will also be sharing them afterwards, but I'll go through some of the actions here with quick links. I also wanted to say I'd be happy to take questions after my presentation, and if I need to leave because I'm not feeling so well, I'd be happy to answer questions afterward. Gabriela will be sending them to me. So if we don't have an opportunity to speak now, I am always available. I love speaking with people. So if you go to right.amnestyusa.org, you will see our Right for Rights cases, and there you'll see the ability to take action on the families in detention action. You'll find resources on how to write and mail or email a letter to ICE demanding it free all families together. And again, the reason we say together is because ICE would actually prefer that families choose to separate than release them together, which is an extraordinarily cruel option. This is not like the forcible separation of families at the border we saw in 2018, but it is still separation of families. ICE has the choice to release families together, but it's opting not to. You'll also find guidance on that page on how you can send families in detention letters of support and solidarity, especially important right now during the holidays. Some of these families, this will be their second holiday season. Some of them They've spent birthdays behind bars. We're talking young children. One of these families, some of you may already know from actions and publicity Amnesty has given. Anna and her 4-year-old daughter fled from repeated threats. Her 4-year-old daughter, Victoria, fled from repeated threats against their lives after Victoria's father was killed for his political beliefs. They requested asylum in the US over 1 year ago and have been locked up ever since. ICE was informed multiple times that Victoria is asthmatic and particularly at risk for COVID. Meanwhile, Anna, her mother, has been suffering from ovarian cysts that have been causing her pain every day for months now. Yet she still hasn't received appropriate medical care. She's trying to stay strong for her daughter, but they are struggling. And Anna and her daughter have anxiety attacks, nightmares, and Victoria wets the bed, something she didn't used to before she was detained. So in addition to mounting pressure on ICE to release these families, we're also driving an urgent action calling on ICE to stop the deportation of 28 children and their parents, 28 other children who are facing removal. Again, you can go to amnestyusa.org/urgent actions, and there you'll find the urgent action to stop the deportation of these 28 children and their families. And on top of that, we hope that you'll take action to free Pastor Stephen, who is still facing deportation, even though it's been stayed. We want him free. We want him to get the medical health he needs, and we want him released to the sponsor who's been waiting 2 years to welcome him. And we also want to free people from detention. While our focus has a lot to do with families, it's not just about families, it's about all people who are detained and their right to liberty, their right to seek asylum, and their right to health. Looking ahead, I also wanted to let you know what we'll be doing to focus on our priorities in a new administration. Like any administration, we want to make sure our elected leaders prioritize the human rights and safety of people in immigration detention. Amnesty's team has submitted issue briefs with a number of policy recommendations for President-elect Biden and his transition team, including on immigration and access to asylum. We will send you a link to those election briefs so you can read those and know what we're asking of the new incoming administration. But here, 4 points we're asking, we will be really prioritizing: immediately release people in immigration detention, including families together; expand the use of community-based alternatives to detention, so there's a presumption of liberty and not detention. People are released in alternative to detention programs; place a temporary moratorium or hold on deportations; and to restore a fair, just, and welcoming asylum process at the border. We have an online petition that we'll be sending to President-elect Biden with these demands, and we really encourage you to sign them. We also will be having a first 100 days campaign. We will also be sending out, we're still deciding on what that will be. That will be a laser focused campaign on what President-elect Biden can do in his first 100 days. I anticipate this will be around detention and reducing the numbers, but we will send out an update as soon as we have that. The President-elect has made a number of promises of what he'll do, and now it's up to us to make sure that he delivers. Thank you very much, and I'm very sorry I can't be on screen, but I'd be happy to take any questions. And if there aren't any, I will turn it over to Bill and we can receive questions at the end.
Thanks, Denise. And thank you, Jim. I also want to thank Melvin for the invitation to speak again here. And I see a couple of other familiar faces in the audience, Bruce and Dolores. It's always nice to see you. I want to give a little bit of a historical context to Denise's presentation, which is extremely important. And I do want to tell you that a lot of the advocacy that my students and other immigrant rights attorneys engage in rely very heavily on the the research and the information that Amnesty International and Denise provide. So I am going to talk about asylum and what's happened in the course of the Trump administration, but I do want to tell you how we got to this point. The framework for asylum in the United States today actually evolved after World War II, and it's anachronistic. There, many of the concepts and ideas for asylum are based on what happened in Europe during World War II and at the end of World War II, and those concepts and principles don't quite fit what's happening on the ground today, not just here in the United States and Central America, but also with respect to the rest of the world. It doesn't take much effort on your part to simply Google the phrase refugees, and you'll find out that there are hundreds of thousands of displaced persons around the world, and that Europe and Asia, other parts of the world are dealing with people that are being persecuted for a variety of reasons that don't quite fit into the 1952 Convention on Refugees, and we haven't even begun to address the fact that we are now beginning to see the beginning of climate refugees, people who are being displaced from where they were born and grew up in large part because of climate change. And there's nothing in the immigration laws and refugee laws that deal with that. So when I won't go back too far, but the current crisis that we're talking about, that is at the heart of what Denise is talking about and the families that she are talking about, flow from largely Central America, but also Mexico. Now, I don't mean to for a minute put aside the political problems that are happening in Venezuela, and in Peru, and other parts of the Americas right now, Haiti, Cuba, those all continue. But going back probably about 12 to 15 years, you began to see a significant flow of people fleeing from what's called the Northern Triangle, which is Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. That's referred to as the Northern Triangle for purposes of what immigrant rights advocates are working on right now. And as I said, also a certain flow of people fleeing violence from Mexico as well. So the flow is very, very different from the flow of so-called undocumented immigrants that many of us still live in. The flow of undocumented immigrants that troubled anti-immigrant folks when I first started practicing immigration law a few decades ago was about undocumented Mexicans coming here to get a job. And that's not the framework that exists today. In fact, the number of undocumented immigrants from Mexico has actually steadily declined over the last 15, 20 years. We're at an all-time low of so-called economic migrants from Mexico. What we are talking about today are people that are fleeing violence. It's not just about people coming here to get a better job. And that flow began in significant numbers during the George W. Bush administration. And as we all know, his administration was very much influenced by 9/11, by the tragedy of September 11th, 2001. Right after that, with the establishment of the passage of the Patriot Act and the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security did not exist until after September 11th, 2011. When it came into being through the lens of national security. And so that everybody who wanted to come to the United States after September 11th and the passage of the Patriot Act and the establishment of Department of Homeland Security was scrutinized through the lens of national security. And so when anti-immigrant advocates saw what was happening, they took advantage of that, and they advocated for closing the border, they advocated for more detention, and even though detention has always been with us, it started in serious fashion during the Bush administration, and also armed raids started in serious fashion during the George Bush administration. And so even though there were significant numbers of refugees beginning to flee, the type of violence that is at the heart of what we're seeing today. And that type of violence is three parts. There's three parts of the violence that people are fleeing. One is gang violence. And there are serious transnational gangs that exist in the Northern Triangle and Mexico. And incidentally, you might be curious to know where and how those gangs started. Well, those gangs in Central America started in the United States. They started largely in Southern California, and those people from, for example, Central America that had entered in an earlier version of fleeing from Central America in the 1980s because of Civil War, who formed gangs in Southern California, they got deported to places like El Salvador and Guatemala. And guess what? They took their gangs with them and they started gangs in those countries. So there's a lot of academic literature on how those gangs began, and they were fed by deportation policies of the United States. So gang violence is one. Cartel violence, drug cartel violence is the other type of violence that we see people fleeing. And I gotta be honest with you, a lot of the cartel, the drug violence has to do with drug usage and demand here in the United States. Those drugs that are being produced are largely coming to the United States to feed the consumer here in the United States who uses drugs. And finally, the third type of violence that we see a lot of is domestic violence. And many of the cultures that we're talking about have a machismo culture that has led to femicide in those countries. And many of the women that we represent and many of the children that we represent are fleeing fierce domestic violence in their households. And so I want to come back to that in a minute. Right now at the immigration clinic that I help to run at USF, we have over 400 asylum applicants. And the vast majority are from the Northern Triangle. And as I said, many are from Mexico as well. And that's pretty much what they're fleeing. They're fleeing one of those three types of violence. They're not coming for adventure. They're not coming to the United States to go to Disneyland. They're coming because they fear for their lives. And so what the Bush administration did was it largely engaged in what is referred to as catch and release. Now, they did engage in some family detention, but not to the degree that we saw prior to the pandemic. And so catch and release is often used as a pejorative term. It's used as, well, you stop these people at the border and then you release them, and it implies that people disappear. Well, the truth is that catch and release worked. It worked in this sense, that you took information from the people that were trying to cross the border, you found out where they were headed. They were headed to Pittsburgh or Chicago or San Francisco or New Jersey, and you found out that they had relatives there, because most of them had friends or relatives in the United States, and you told them you've got to show up at your deportation hearing on this particular date in St. Louis, where your friend or relative is going to greet you. And guess what? There was a 99% appearance rate. There was not a problem with absconsion with the catch and release program. And the Obama administration essentially continued that policy of catch and release with very much success until the summer of 2014. In the summer of 2014, there was a particularly large surge of unaccompanied minors that came from the Northern Triangle. And this is where I have a bone to pick with the Obama administration, and many other people do as well. And the fact that there were over 60,000 unaccompanied minors that came to the US southern border in 2014. And that got headlines, but what did not get headlines was that same year in 2014, there were also 60,000 family units, largely women and children, that were also fleeing for the Northern Triangle. And as Denise mentioned, there are these two big family centers in Texas, Karnes and Dilley, and I've been an inspector at the Dilley facility. It's not a fun place. And then there's this third one in Berks. Prior to Dilley, Texas, and Karnes, Texas, the Obama administration opened a facility in New Mexico that was closed within a couple months because the conditions were so bad. That was all in 2014, and that was all under the watch of President Obama. Now, why would he do that? Why would he open family detention centers? Well, and he admits this in public statements. I just got his book, and I can't find an admission in his new book on this, but he has admitted it in interviews that he was trying to be tough on immigration because he wanted the Republicans to come to the table so that he could get an agreement on comprehensive immigration reform. And he gave a speech in El Paso in 2012 where he admitted that that the Republicans kept moving the goalpost on him, and that they never were bargaining with him in good faith. But in 2014, he continued this hardline notion, and he opened these family detention centers. And now he did not have kids in cages the way that President Trump accused Biden in, I guess it was their second debate. It wasn't to that degree, but there was family detention, and that was a disappointment. But when President Trump took over, we know that part of the reason he was elected in 2016 was because of his anti-immigrant rhetoric, beginning with the anti-Mexican rhetoric, and then the wall, and then calling people on the caravans terrorists, and so that has resulted in an agenda on the Trump administration's part to basically end asylum. There's no doubt in my mind that his goal is to not grant asylum to anyone trying to come to the United States. You also may recall in 2016, he spoke out very vocally against any Syrian refugees coming to the United States. He just didn't want immigrants from the Middle East or from Latin America coming into the United States. And I got to be frank, I think that with respect to Latin America, it has a lot to do with his racial views towards people from Latin America. And so what has he done? Well, again, prior to the pandemic, he engaged in this, what's often, he calls it MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocol, or the Remain in Mexico system, which is that those few that we're going to let approach the border after a waiting list system we'll let you apply, but you've got to wait in Mexico. Well, including Amnesty International, every human rights entity that has looked at the border situation, again, prior to the pandemic, in places like Nogales, Sonora, Matamoros on the other side of the Texas border, Tijuana on the other side of the California border, those conditions under which people are remaining are very dangerous. There have been thousands of people who have died, who have been killed, having to remain in Mexico under the Remain in Mexico policy. Again, I'm talking pre-pandemic, which is, that part is continued under the pandemic as well. What else did he institute? He instituted something called the third country bar, that if you travel through a third country before you get to the US border, you have to apply for asylum and be denied in that third country first, okay? And so obviously people from the Northern Triangle have all traveled through Mexico. And so he forced people to apply for asylum in Mexico, which has never been equipped to handle asylum applicants. But beginning with Obama, but expanding under Trump, the United States has funneled hundreds of millions of dollars to Mexico to basically have a new immigration system that prevents people from coming to the United States. Big disappointment was the Mexican president in agreeing to go along with that policy under the Trump administration. And so there's, my students and I filed a complaint, a human rights complaint in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And we had a hearing 2 months ago where the commission is going to, our complaint was against the United States and Mexico for violating the human rights of legitimate asylum seekers from Central America. We expect a decision any day by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which will chastise the United States and Mexico for violating human rights of these asylum seekers. Another example is something called the ACA, Asylum Cooperation Agreements. The United States has strong-armed, believe it or not, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras into agreeing to handle asylum applicants from people from other countries. And every human rights organization in the world, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have said that that is a ridiculous notion, that Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras, some of the most dangerous places in the world, should be entertaining asylum applications for people who are fleeing other violence. And I guess the final thing that I'll say, because Denise did such an excellent job talking about detention, I just want to segue on one thing she talked about, which is the pandemic and COVID. The United States basically has shut the border to all asylum seekers since March. And I was in Nogales, Sonora, right before the shutdown. I was in Nogales, Sonora for 5 days with students and other attorneys the first week of March before the shutdown. And we were there to help people prepare their asylum applicants. And some of these families, they have kids that are infants, people that are nursing. They have no place to stay. Many of them are staying on the streets. And as soon as we got back to the United States was when the shutdown began. And then this COVID order came in, which was that under the pretext of COVID that, oh, no one can come in because they're going to spread the virus. Well, every human rights expert has looked at that order and has agreed that we do not need to close the southern border to asylum seekers to protect against the spread of the pandemic. All we need to do is practice real health care that practices that we're all aware of, that you screen people, and if they are sick, then you isolate them and you treat them. If they're not sick, then you let them in and apply for asylum. It's just like, it's using common sense when it comes to what's required of healthcare. So let me stop there and open it up to questions. I will chime in with what Denise says. We're hoping that President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris do the right thing, but it's going to take a long time to correct what's happened. There's been an attack on domestic violence as a legitimate ground for asylum by the Trump administration. We want that all changed. They're not actually going to do that. They're not going to do those things automatically for us. We wish that, but they just like I've been around long enough to know that that presidents and their administrations will not automatically do the right thing unless there is pressure on them to do it. And so our job is not over after January 20th. Thanks.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Would you like for me to read them? Or,
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And I guess this is to both speakers. So you mentioned the administration. What can Biden do through executive action that you would like to see him do?
You want me to go first, Denise?
Sure.
Well, one thing, he could end this migrant protection protocol thing and reinstitute allowing people in to apply. That, remember this, there was no new immigration law passed under Donald Trump. And so everything that he did was by executive order. So in theory, all the bad stuff that Trump did, Biden could undo. So that's one. And the other thing that I just alluded to at the end of my talk is that his Attorney General issued a decision that basically makes it hard for somebody fleeing domestic violence to get asylum. And that could be undone as well by having his Attorney General undo that decision. And just any other number of things. He could stop spending money on this crazy wall idea. He can do the right thing, not just for dreamers through DACA, but he could issue an executive order protecting their parents or parents of US citizens. Those are just a few examples. I'm sure Denise has others.
And no, all of those, and then I'd add to sign an executive order rescinding the Muslim African asylum bans and MPP, the Migration Protection Protocols that Bill was talking about, also known as Remain in Mexico. He can take executive action to halt deportations for the first 100 days, a moratorium as he's promised. Also to reinstate the parole authority, which is a presumption of release for people who are in detention. To reinstate family case management program, which is an alternative to detention program for families in detention, and also to direct DHS to robustly expand the use of community-based case management support where necessary, which again is alternative to detention. There should be a presumption against detention in favor of liberty, and he can, and through his executive order, restore these and expand those, and the use of private prisons in immigration detention, and also end family detention, close the family residential centers, and end the practice of detaining families.
Okay. Here's one from Bruce. California legislatively abolished private prisons and detention centers. How has ICE managed to skirt that law, and what is happening with private prisons and detention centers in California now?
Right. So first of all, just to tie what Denise said in with Bruce's question, under the Obama administration, the Obama administration decided to no longer use private prison companies to detain federal prisoners in the criminal justice system, because they realized that private prison companies like Geo Group and Core Civic, these are billion-dollar private prison companies, that they were they didn't run a prison that that was respectful of human life. And there's just all these tragic stories of people dying and being abused in private prisons. But Obama didn't extend that to immigration detention, to ICE detention. And so California decided, after a lot of lobbying in California, this is Bruce's question, to pass a law that a governmental entity cannot enter into contract with a private prison company to do any detention, not just immigration detention, but any detention in California. The problem is that any contract that existed prior to the passage of that law could continue. So that's one reason why some of the private prison companies that detain immigrants continue, because they were under the old contract. And also the other problem is that that's being litigated now. So the private prison companies are litigating to challenge the constitutionality of that California law. But the short answer is that what's existing right now, some have closed, but what's in existence right now were contracts that existed prior to the passage of that California law.
Everything to add to that, Denise?
No, I think Bill covered it well. Plus, it's his state. He would know much better than I.
Right. Okay, I have a question from Larry. So, are there any efforts being made to accommodate climate refugees as legitimate refugees?
Well, there's talk, but it would require, well, there's two approaches. One is to pass a new asylum law in the United States that accommodates people that have been displaced because of climate change. Either doing it nationally, federally here in the United States, or beginning to address it on an international stage. And there are efforts on the international stage to provide some guidance. Denise may know more about that internationally.
It's there. Yes, you're right, Bill. There are things going on at both levels. International, there's discussion of this. People are wary of reopening the Refugee Convention, which defines a refugee. But at the same time, because of global anti-refugee sentiment and with the lapse in US leadership, how that has threatened the foundations of refugee protection globally, just because what we does have a knock-on effect around refugees. However, people are talking at the international level about how to accommodate the fact that people are displaced because of climate and the human rights protections around that. In terms of the US, there has been legislation not defining people displaced by climate, the crisis, as refugees, but trying to find ways to give them humanitarian protections. So people are working within the system of how to acknowledge massive displacements, which happen in other contexts well, and make sure that people are being recognized by national and international mechanisms at the same time, while they may not technically be called a refugee. It's a very sensitive topic, and people are trying to negotiate within the existing international framework and existing law without jeopardizing any protections.
Okay, thank you. We have one from Anne. What countries have a humane immigration policy and the infrastructure to offer safe asylum to immigrants? I keep wondering when the USA cannot take care of its homeless and the coming wave of unemployed and houseless, what we can offer on a large scale to asylum seekers and climate immigrants. So that's to either or both.
Well, go ahead, Denise. Go ahead.
I will start. This is a very good question because it's so you're right. It's how do I say this? Right now in the US, there is this question, like, how do we help one population? Does helping one population mean that we can't help another? And we already have so many issues here to grapple with, and a sense of limited resources. One opportunity to help people who come to the US, whether they're resettled as a refugee or come here as an asylum seeker or a person who has come to the US for whatever reason, is through something called sponsorship. And for resettled refugees, that means a group of people come together and work with a resettlement agency to help with helping a resettled refugee or refugee family build a new life here in the community. We're trying to stand that up as well for asylum seekers and migrants. There are some resettlement agencies that are looking to do this. And this is what we refer to as an extended case management program. Because if there are people who are allowed to come into the US because the Remain in Mexico policy is rescinded, which we hope, and the Centers for Disease Control order is lifted as we hope, there will be more arrivals, as there should be, because people have the right to seek asylum. But of course, we need to make sure if people are supported. And so the community can come in and help with that case management program by offering different means of support. It's not a legal obligation, but it helps people become part of their community and navigate and make sure that they can have a successful life here while they pursue their right to seek asylum.
Yeah, as for a couple of examples, again, no country is perfect, but Canada, for example, doesn't wholesale detain asylum seekers. And in fact, they provide language training and job training to people even before they've applied, even before they've been granted asylum. When they're asylum seekers applying for asylum, they actually get treated like human beings. And of course, you know, Angela Merkel did get beaten down quite a bit after she did this, but she actually created a very friendly, safe environment. She did her best for a period of time in Germany when the Syrian refugee crisis began 5-6 years ago, and it's something that we should applaud her for and try to emulate, because she really did try to do the right thing when it came to refugees.
If I could just follow up on that, how has the integration of those refugees in Germany been? Has that worked pretty well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very familiar with social science literature that's evolving now in parts of Europe that deals with the assimilation of refugees. And when it works, is something that's related to what Denise just said. When it works is when community residents recognize that it's a two-way street when it comes to the integration of newcomers, that it's not simply the responsibility of the newcomers, that we should be setting up welcoming centers and looking for community residents and volunteers to step up and help volunteer to meet with people, show them how to use the bus, show them what are the benefits of a particular community and that kind of stuff. I mean, for heaven's sakes, we can all recognize to a certain degree how it would feel if you came to a place where everyone was cold versus a place where there's at least some open arms that are there for you.
Okay, so the next is pretty long. This is from Dolores and David, I believe. Thank you for speaking on this, Dr. Hing. Looking forward to the new Biden administration and what they will do about policies regarding immigration. How can we place our hope with the Democrats? Back in 2009, when the elite of Honduras, along with the US military and elite, wanted to get rid of President Zelaya because of his policies to help the poor, they held a coup d'etat, and Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, did not stop this unauthorized coup. This was the first step which caused great flow of the poor out of Honduras at the time, fleeing for their lives. So how can we have hope for the improved policies in Latin America?
Yeah, Dolores, that's a smart question, of course, and it's up to us to hold our political leaders accountable Um, Before the pandemic, I remember going to the church to listen to Jim Gallagher talk about a Marshall Plan for Central America, as many of you may recall, and um, what it takes now. The Biden plan, if you look online, you can see the Biden immigration plan. It actually does include huge investments in Central America to help address the root causes, which is always good. I mean, we shouldn't just be focused on receiving asylum. We should also be focused on how can we help resolve the root causes. The problem is the United States has this terrible habit of going around and telling people what to do, okay? And so we need to work with other international agencies and legitimate non-governmental organizations in those parts of the world that have credibility to see how our money can be wisely used. And I'll be honest with you, I've spoken with people in Honduras. They actually do not want United States help. They want to be left alone. They view the United States as at fault for a lot of what has occurred there. And so it's going to be a matter of an international coalition that comes together with credible people and credible entities to address these problems in a long-range, permanent way.
Okay. Next one from Anne. Does the USA or resettlement agencies give financial support to asylum seekers and refugees?
Yes, so I would just say the U.S. Resettlement Program, which is the U.S. RAP, is a public-private partnership between the U.S. government and 9 resettlement agencies, 9 national resettlement agencies, which have affiliates across the country. And through that, there is limited financial assistance offered to refugees in the process of being resettled and starting new lives. In terms of asylum seekers, no. However, asylees, people who have been granted asylum in the US, so refugees under a different name, have the opportunity to have limited financial assistance. The US program is very much based on financial self-sufficiency, or is based on self-sufficiency, unlike other models in the US. And there are pros and cons to that in terms of building a community network and integration, which is where sponsors come in and are so critical. But this program was started with the Refugee Act of 1980, which codified the international definition of refugee into US law.
Okay. So another one from Bruce. While there's endless and is ever more dependent on cheap labor, so it's my understanding that there is constant recruiting of workers basically denied their rights who are brought across the southern border. These movements are almost never discussed. Any comments? Like I said, for either one of you.
Well, the first, and this isn't exactly what Bruce is asking about, but we should acknowledge how critical immigrant workers have, the role they played during the pandemic as essential workers, and just how they ought to be among the first, obviously, to receive the vaccine because of the rates of infections in communities of color, especially, has been very high. The Trump administration, quite frankly, has turned a blind eye to the recruitment that's going on. That they don't really care. It's not clear. It's been very clear that the Trump administration doesn't really have a well thought out plan when it comes to integrating immigrants into the economy and recognizing the role that they play. So for my money, it's thank goodness he'll be out of office, and we can think of a way that that we begin to become respectful of the role that immigrants, including undocumented workers, play in the economy.
I would just add to that, with agreeing with Bill. I mean, there is this, the current administration is playing both sides of the coin. And what we need to do is focus on the benefit that essential workers, who are often immigrant workers, and some of whom may be undocumented, have contributed to the economy, but also our well-being, particularly during the time of COVID. And also that we need to protect the works of the rights of all workers, whether they be documented or undocumented, citizens or not. And we have seen abuse there. So we need to, particularly through workplace raids, which I wrote a report on. And what we find is there's often an attacks on the workers themselves, but not on their employers. And the systems in which they're employed, which abuse their right to work, their right to health, and their right to be protected from arbitrary arrest and detention.
Okay. See, I have a question. Is the U.S. in violation of any international laws or international agreements regarding immigration and asylum seekers?
Bill,
Where should we begin, Denise? Go ahead.
I know. I'm like, which one aren't they? Right? I'll let you go, Bill.
Well, I mean, the truth is that we're celebrating Human Rights Day, which took place a couple of days ago, and let me say something shocking to any non-lawyers or people that are unfamiliar with the United States and its relationship to international law. Basically, I'm not overstating this. Okay, the United States does not follow international laws and treaties that it is a party to when it's not convenient to the United States. Nobody holds the United States accountable. You can go back decades. The United States uses international laws when it's convenient to the United States. I'm talking about Republicans and Democrats, okay? And it ignores them when it's not convenient. And it's sad, but true.
And I would only add to that, and this is, it's absolutely right. Whether Democratic, Republican, whatever administration, the U.S. hews to international human rights law or law when it's convenient to it. But that's why it's so extraordinary about the Refugee Convention and the 1967 Protocol, is that we actually took international human rights law and we made it U.S. law. And that is the Refugee Act of 1980. We took the international definition of refugee, we made it U.S. law. And that's why when people refer to so-called illegal aliens or people coming here against the law, we made it, Congress passed a law and the president signed it, that every person has the right to seek asylum in the US. And while we don't have an obligation to resettle refugees from abroad, we have a responsibility to share protection amongst the international community for refugees. Refugees abroad should be resettled here, commensurate with our responsibility. People who come to our borders and ask for asylum are actually following US law that we thought was so important. We took international law and made it US law. And so I just like to emphasize that point. And what we've seen under this administration is basically an attempt to revoke US law, that commitment. So it's extremely important that we advocate for refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants. We thought human rights were so important in this area, we made it US law, and that's exceedingly rare for the US.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we have another question from Anne. Do any asylum seekers and immigrants have access to free healthcare, nutrition, housing, and so forth?
Well, as an applicant, as an asylum applicant, you only are eligible for whatever the state or local government might provide someone in your circumstance. So there's no federal law that assures such a person of housing or public benefits or healthcare or anything like that. But as some of you may know, in California, for example, somebody who doesn't have documentation can actually get some coverage under the California version of the ACA. In San Francisco, they're under something called Healthy San Francisco. If you're undocumented, you can get healthcare, and you can get certain government assistance, but until you've actually been granted asylum, you're not eligible for most benefits. You can, although the Trump administration is changing this, you can apply for an employment permission. You can apply for an employment authorization document when you're an asylum applicant after a certain amount of time has passed. But again, the Trump administration is trying to foreclose that possibility.
Can I just add to that, Bill? I mean, this is one of the, where people who immigrate here or seek asylum, where they're really caught in this catch-22. I think almost every person in the world, wherever you're located, want to be able to support themselves and their families. And if you're here and you're deprived of the opportunity to work with authorization, then how are you going to support yourself? You're going to live in poverty. So it defeats the purpose of allowing people to be self-sufficient. If you come here to ask for asylum and you ask for an employment authorization, but you're stripped of that ability, then how are you going to support yourself? People want to be able to support themselves. That's what we see again and again and again.
Okay, thank you. I have a question regarding foreign aid to the countries in Central America. I know these countries must have a lot of problems. You mentioned the gangs, the drug issues. I don't know if these governments want to protect their citizens but are unable to, or maybe they're corrupt and don't want to, and they don't care or whatever. So I'm wondering, if that's the case, how can aid to those countries help? If they are corrupt, I don't know if they're corrupt, but if they are, if you think they are.
Yeah, that's I'm telling you, that's $1 million question, because we can. I agree with the implication of that question. There's no way we should just throw money at particular governments and expect them to do the right thing. I have to believe. Otherwise, if I didn't believe what I'm about to say, then I would be driving myself crazy. I have to believe that there's a way of those countries getting their feet on the ground and minimizing corruption and working on their economies meaningfully, stopping to end human rights violations. But I have to believe that that's possible. But I also believe that I'm not crazy, that I can't believe that can be done overnight. And so it takes smarter, it's going to take a smarter person than I am, for sure, and a lot of people working together to solve those problems. But it's crazy for us to not be thinking about that. It's crazy for us to not be helping to address those problems, because I don't want me or my successors to be put in this position again 20 years later, 30 years later, where we see a continuing flow of people from Central America. I lived through this in the 1980s. And here we are again with a different flow from very much the same countries, although back then it would include Nicaragua. And it's going to take time, but it's crazy for us to not work on these issues.
Okay, thank you. I think she had some follow-up she wanted to talk about before we call it quits.
Yeah, thanks. So thank you so much for co-sponsoring this event with us. We're thrilled to be here. We're the local Amnesty chapter in San Francisco, Group 30. And Denise and Bill, what an honor to be able to be a part of this panel. I did want to say that I put in some actions that everyone can click on. In anything that you see in the chat is either an action or a bit of information of what you can do to actually help be a voice in speaking out against the abuses. And I also want to say that our group, Local Group 30, is sponsoring a family from Afghanistan. Yesterday, we just did the move of many of the items. Some of the members are on this meeting. And so the Unitarian, local groups, anybody can actually take part in the Amnesty sponsorship program, or we're doing it through the International Rescue Committee, and there's other settlement agencies that have similar programs. So it's a beautiful thing to do. It makes you feel like you're actually doing something to help rather than just sitting around feeling frustrated that you can't do anything. I wear a different hat. I wear many hats. I like hats, but I'm part of the Stop the Outbreak, the San Quentin COVID outbreak that happened, which in my view is a human rights disaster. It was 100% avoidable. They did a transfer of infected people to San Quentin. They took them from CIM and transferred them over to San Quentin that had no incarcerated people with COVID. And there's two men, they're firefighters, and they were moved they were moved for release, moved from San Quentin into ICE detention. One as far away as Louisiana, and they were ready for release and their families are ready for them, but instead they're being threatened with deportation back to Laos. And if I'm going to put 2 petitions in the chat, and if you can all kindly sign them and forward them, that would be very helpful to them, because they're firefighters. They were risking their lives to save ours. So these are my actions that I hope everyone on this call can take. And also, if you have any questions at all, I will give my information and also be able to forward any questions for Denise. And thank you all for attending, and thank you for all your concern or care for people seeking asylum and refugees. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else have any last comments they would like to say or ask? See, I think we have everything. Okay, Bruce has an announcement here. For those interested, there's a vigil every Wednesday morning at rush hour, 8 to 9 a.m. at the UU Franklin, where'd it go? Franklin and Geary, where we raise the demand to end child detention and to close the camps. We get good response from passerbys. And then we have the link that G just put there. So if no one else has any questions or comments right now, I just want to thank our speakers. It was a very informative, very, very important topic, and we really appreciate you coming. Appreciate G and Melvin for organizing this, and all of you for coming and discussing this important topic.